Good morning. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Verisign. And thank you all the beautiful people who are here. So my talk today is on FreeBSD, and I'll touch on some other virtualization systems in other BSDs. So as Glenn touched on for my day job, I do open source enterprise storage, mostly through supporting FreeNAS and working with IX systems. As the previous talk mentioned, they're very good people doing very good things for the community. And in my spare time, I've been doing virtualization work for way too long. So in 2015, we will call that operating system containment and app containment. I prefer the term multiplicity because it's a more computer science term, and we've been pluralizing various aspects of Unix for decades, but containment works. I can live with that. So my motivation starts here. This is a January 1991 computer shopper. Is anyone old enough to remember these? Yes, and I can pass that around afterwards. And if you go to the back of this, there's an Amiga section and a Unix section and all these operating systems that just, that's like, that's cool. But I couldn't quite afford the hardware to give those a try, especially if it's a different platform. And I couldn't afford the disk space back then to wipe and go with that. So the moment I saw that and had been following that and using a Mac on my desktop, in my first computer science class, they sat me down at a BSD 4.3 machine. And little did I know what that meant, but coming from Hollywood, I saw the text console and I thought, I recognize this. That's behind the camera. That's how the system works. It's not the facade, it's where the heavy lifting is done. So I thought, okay, let's combine these. I just want that stuff. I want the operating systems. I want pretty much any OS or any binary under one keyboard. And is that too much to ask? So my journey's been long and laborious. I'm very, very grateful that I sat down at Unix about 5-6 months before Linux was announced. It was a very different internet culture back then. There were flame wars. There was proprietary Unix of AIX and HPUX and all these things that are not talked about a whole lot right now. And I like many people, discovered Red Hat 5.2, which is a nice scrappy Unix clone. And remarkably, Red Hat 6 became a remarkably crappy Windows clone with GNOME Beta something that they included. You may remember those days. And I came across Jail, and I thought, okay, after all the RPM hell, show of hands, anyone remember those good old days? With Jail, you could drop things in there and have it all go away in an instant. So I started scripting that, and it was a novel, neat trick. FreeBSD 5 introduced some very nice management tools, but under the hood, it was a wee unstable, and that was a bit discouraging. I moved on to OpenBSD, and with a colleague created SysJail on top of the systrace device. Robert Watson, who's not here today, blew a hole in that at his Woot talk about the possible concurrency issues with systrace, but it was a useful tool, a lot like the original Chroot that I'll touch on. And with that same colleague, Christoph Johnsons, I helped develop mult, which is a pluralized NetBSD kernel. Everything in it on up is in a completely separate instance, and that was a research project. And then things got interesting. I was the first external bhyve user, and I'll get to the bhyve history in a minute. And in the middle there, tried NetBSD Xen, which never broke for me, so I think it's one of those best kept secrets in the community. Apparently it runs Windows, and it's done it for a very long time, but they're hush-hush about that. And continuing with the bhyve work, helping out Roger with, say, Xen Dom 0 packaging was very, very simple, and just put the right people in touch and did in weeks what took years with bhyve. And thanks to Nikolai, who's here today, very significant progress has been made with Docker on FreeBSD, and I'll touch on that. So a theme I will be pounding on this next while is why BSD. As was touched on in the very introduction from some of those first packets on the internet, it was critical infrastructure ready from day one. It was based on genuine upstream AT&T Unix. It was not a community project. It's not an experiment. It's not a research project, though at Berkeley it was both pushed forward, both in research, and George can give you some, I'm sure, wonderful stories about the good old days. And that's been tangible, and I trust all of you are here today thanks to some milestone in the last 30 years that brought it here. So I consider it genuine Unix. That's where things ended up. And there's long-term thinking there that is very palpable in everything we do. And it's a natural containment environment. So we have things like fixed points of references. And speaking primarily of FreeBSD, but OpenBSD and NetBSD all have their source tree. They have their ports trees. They have things on, say, FreeBSD source.conf to build what you want to build. There's the kernel configuration. You know where to look. You add and remove what devices matter to you and other options. I believe there's skip directories on OpenBSD that allows you to prune your system. And people have been doing that for a very, very long time. So we've also had very good software packaging. The package add utility in the good old days, package thanks to Baptiste, and package source on NetBSD, which is proving very useful on very many platforms. So kudos to that effort. I host the Portland Linux Unix group and had Allison Randall, who's a wonderful person who was the canonical release engineer at the time. And I accidentally asked her, so how do I check out and build Ubuntu? And you don't ask how you check out and build a Linux distribution, because the package teams all work on their packages and they apply their tools, and then you do all this stuff. Whereas here, it's a few commands that are easily scripted. So in this legacy of containment, the chroot utility has been around since late 70s, but I believe it was Bill Joy, George can confirm this, that thought, well, if we have this utility, what if we prevented processes from escaping out of it and added a simple containment hardening feature in 1981. In 1996, we saw compat Linux, back in those classic Unix days when compat everything else was very popular. And in 2000, the Jail utility on FreeBSD, I'll touch on that briefly. NetBSD was one of the very first Xen platforms. And that's been alive and well for a very long time, but very well quietly hidden. And my participation with SysJail, which was a useful tool, especially for packaging and prototyping systems. So we have decades of great technology, originally government funded through DARPA, and simple licensing. That's a theme I'll touch on very briefly. We have great people. We have humble marketing. As an audience member kindly pointed out last night, that we're not loud. We're not over-promising, which is a good aspect of that, but there's work we can all do in that regard. And the results are organizations like Scale Engine. Alan's here, and I'll call it a skeleton crew, does amazing things. They do the work of many, many people. They do not brute force their solutions. They think them through and act very effectively. Tarsnap, I call him Percival, very small organization and very effective. I trust there's some users in the audience today. Netgate, relatively small organization doing significant network hardware with pfSense. And it's amazing what you can do when your tools are not out to complicate your life. Henning Brouwer's web hosting. The packet filter guy runs an ISP. That's dog fooding level pro. So that is what naturally comes out of this. Netflix's work with FreeBSD has been most impressive, virtually off-the-shelf FreeBSD pumping out a third of the evening internet traffic in the US. That's impressive. And so a theme of work smarter, not harder, that's one of the inspirational poster phrases, but it's very tangible here. And to top it off, it's the ZFS silly. So Michael Lucas and Alan Jude have recently produced a book on the topic. It's very good, and they're following it up with another one. And if you come from the good old days, ZFS is very, very refreshing. It includes institutionalized checksumming. It includes low-cost snapshotting and clones, and it is insanely flexible. Are there any ZFS users in the room? Okay, half the hands went up, and who will soon be a ZFS user? So hook up with Alan, who's here, find out what's going on. I personally believe that all roads lead to their approach, and maybe they do it differently in 2017, 18, 19, but when Kirk McKusick says ZFS is awesome, I'm willing to go with that. So, to use one of two buzzwords in this entire talk, when you combine storage and containment, you get hyperconvergence, a term coined by the Tenea group, and that's cool. In the good old days, we've had our SANs, we've had our compute nodes, and hopefully having affordable infrastructure between them, and when that 100 gig arrives, hopefully it'll be the cost of 1 gig, and we're getting there, we're getting there. And in 2015, to get right on topic, VMware is the market leader. They just had VMworld, and I'm sure there's some VMware users in the house. Any hands, show of hands? And I trust you love your software and love its licensing, and it does what you need it to do. And there's an interesting trend emerging that they've been sued for GPL compliance, and other vendors are delivering nifty solutions, offering slim offers of source. They then perhaps perform acrobatics in user space because they can't touch the kernel, because those shouldn't be barriers to your development. They shouldn't be barriers to your kernel development and your delivery of a product, of a service, of a hobby, you name it. And I would love to see all of those vendors come forward with the proper offers of source and compliance with the licenses, and it baffles me how the CTOs of the world, investors, don't quite grasp the terms of the GPL, but that's an emerging theme. So fortunately, open source is winning. Things like PostgreSQL and a hypervisor or two, they were all inconceivable. If we look at the great Web 2.0s of the Facebooks, the Googles, and their entire open source back infrastructure, things like traditional licensing, say $50 per client access license for 1 billion users, I think that adds up pretty darn quick. And the result is you can hire pretty much the best people on the planet. So we are winning, but it took time. And in 2015, as I see it, virtualize or die. I don't care about your app if I can't easily run it. I can't experiment with it. It should be effortless. And developers are getting this. Along the same lines, your OS had better virtualize it. I want to try it. I still want to try it since the late 80s, early 90s, and administrators are getting this. If there's a promise that some OS does something great, make it easy to try. So, here and now, we have a tradition of containment, a suitable environment, and a tradition of Jail, Xen, Docker, and bhyve, all on OpenZFS, which is one of our key distinguishing features on this side of the river. And FreeBSD Jail, it's been a proven container for 15 years. People have been making money with it from day one. It's got a very good track record. And in practice, EasyJail has been the way to do it, very popular among users. Those built-in tools never quite reach their potential, and that's just fine because it's easy to manage. There's very impressive work being done with IOCage, which is a jail management system that institutionalizes ZFS use. It saves parameters and ZFS flags. It embraces the fact that you may want to snapshot a given resource and clone it and go to town. And it's a bit elusive, but there's a VPS project that apparently includes live migration. There's a code dump every few months, and that's worth following, and hopefully that person will be up here with a clear explanation of what that is someday. And thanks to developer Roger, we have FreeBSD Xen support, DOM 0. That's something that NetBSD has been doing for a very long time. The approach is HVM hardware acceleration, a bit like bhyve, where we are embracing the built-in processor features, and that's a whole shift for the Xen project. And for those of you, Xen, it has a great many moving parts, and they get the benefit of great simplicity through doing this, but it took them quite a while to get there. They have a very strong community. That's something we can all work on. And again, Roger is bringing them up to speed. Up and coming is ARM support, and I'll touch on where we're headed all with that. And you can check out the wiki for more details on that. I've updated that this morning. And thanks to Colin once again. Yeah, let's see, Amazon's been running Xen for a very long time to support their legacy hardware, and that's making people money. That's proven reliable. We have Colin to just push on that for years now, and thank you, Colin, for keeping that consistent. And as we move on to the modern era, we have FreeBSD Docker. And that's how it's done right now. Fantastic marketing. That's impressive. We can certainly learn from that. And unlike cloud, there's an actual project you can download and install and try. So that's a huge plus to them. And fortunately, on FreeBSD, there is institutionalized jail and ZFS, and they've embraced that thanks to the team doing FreeBSD Docker. Linux is struggling with how to contain Docker. Well, we've done that for 15 years. When you have an environment of disposable machines, you want something like ZFS to clone, snapshot, rollback effortlessly. And so I encourage you, if you're doing anything with Docker, get out there and give it a try. Give the feedback. It does native binaries, and we've had a recent breakthrough of the Linux compatibility layer receiving 64-bit support. Huge support there. Joyent, the SmartOS people, are banking on that same model, but we've had all the tools for a very long time, and I encourage you to give that a try. So again, leverage your environment. If you have a great file system with great features, use it. If you have lightweight containment, use it. It drops right in, and the Docker import took a matter of weeks of just putting the right people in touch with each other. And back to the general theme there. One user explained Docker as a system administrator's view of the world. If you can't work on the upstream packages, you can't work on the kernel, you're stuck in between, you come up with shims top and bottom and fit in what you want to do, and hopefully it works out for you. And from a FreeBSD perspective, oh, you mean Podria? You build your own packages and you just have complete control. You know, the Postgres database is Postgres on any platform, and you build it with just a handful of flags. So this really shouldn't be a lifestyle decision. It's a question of the tools at hand. And I have some significant ties to Latvia, and I look at this as what I call the Latvian spelling bee. Does anyone know what's unique about a Latvian spelling bee? So the alphabet is phonetic. They don't have spelling bees. We don't have that problem. It's an environment completely free of the problem, and that is possible. So that a spelling bee would be like rattling off numbers. Oh, 257, 257. Good work, Johnny. So it is possible to have a nice, clean environment where it's like, what's the problem? So that said, with the Xen and Docker communities, I am not convinced they want to be GNU Linux people. They are by circumstance, but in most cases, they are Unix people. And I think they will appreciate the tools and community and events we have. And I welcome you to invite them and get them participating. So out of all that, fortunately, are a lot of interesting ideas, unikernels, be it a bare minimum kernel with one application on it that perhaps is even in a command pipeline and comes up and goes while you execute more things around it. To me, that means a nice source tree, a kernel config, a source config, and you just pare it down. And out of NetBSD, rump kernels, user space kernels, some interesting networking things are happening. I just heard there's a FreeBSD user space network stack taking place, and that's exciting. But if you step back, it's server-side embedded development. That's old news. It just happens to be available in the cloud on the internet, and that's cool, I suppose. So I encourage you to ruthlessly wield Occam's razor, slim things down to simplicity, to the bare minimum that meets your needs. And again, Postgres is Postgres, and that's a rather large example, but with smaller applications, just bring in the bare minimum kernel, and it can be done. And NanoBSD has been institutionalized for producing, say, embedded systems on FreeBSD for a very long time, and let's all commit to just keeping such tools up to date. Let's make them ZFS aware. Let's make them suitable so that things like a, say, VMware alternative is a question of choosing NanoBSD, certain kernel configuration, and a management system to just get systems launched and migrated. So this ecosystem of all these parts, the GNU part of GNU Linux, all these things is great, but it produces yet more parts to manage the existing parts. And again, it's a problem we generally don't have. So enter bhyve. The history of bhyve is that it is directly a result of an UnConference. Anyone at MeetBSD 2010, show hands? It was a fantastic event. And we broke the UnConference rule, and everyone went to one session. We just moved all the chairs, got in a circle, and day one concluded we need a hypervisor. And day two, there was a little private meeting with various vendors saying, we need a hypervisor. And fast forward a year, which is a relatively short amount of time, out came a presentation on a bhyve from a prominent storage vendor. And I found that quite fascinating, having been struggling with this topic for a very, very long time. And in 2012, that hit head, and fortunately arrived in 2014 with FreeBSD 10. In the same year, 32-bit support came along, and AMD support came this year, and UEFI BIOS support is in the works, and I'll touch on that a little later. So what is bhyve? bhyve is a portable, hardware-assisted, emulation-free, permissively licensed, patent unencumbered kernel module and utilities, and collectively a hypervisor. And it's tiny. It leverages hardware. The kernel module, under 300 kilobytes. And the utilities to make it work, some housekeeping utilities, and the actual process that runs, which has a little more responsibility. And it's a great departure from the pudge that you find in the traditional solutions. And I think of that as working on the same theme of work smarter, not harder. So bhyve is proven portable. There's xhyve on OS 10 for all the Macs out there. OS 10 Yosemite has introduced a hypervisor framework that allows for apparently any hypervisor to drop in. Someone combined the two. There is a proprietary pluribus netvisor on Illumos. There's a title scale hyperkernel on FreeBSD. And if you've heard of any of these nifty projects, please let the bhyve folks know, because they're traditionally the last people to ever hear of something cool being done on bhyve. So I kindly request that. And bhyve is capable. It's run FreeBSD and Linux from day one. It allowed a vendor to include their acquisitions under the hood without having to port very much. And it supported OpenBSD for a very long time, NetBSD. The team's been great about outreach to just get other BSDs on board. They've offered help to port it to other BSDs. And it supports GNU Linux. And waiting in the wings are Illumos and Windows. And there are bhyve users in this room. I understand various parts of the FreeBSD build cluster use it, I believe with Jenkins. And user number 2, Alan Jude, even before it officially released in 10, replaced his one CentOS system that ran that one app that only ran on CentOS with a bare metal FreeBSD box and bhyve. And it's been serving him very, very well. Certain vendors, at least one, use bhyve to handle their Linux acquisitions, just to simplify and streamline without a major porting effort. And there are various hush-hush projects I get tiny bits of insights about where there are at least 300 node bhyve clusters, and I hope that those users will come forward with case studies, but for now we patiently wait. bhyve is very performant. You get bare metal CPU performance, and in some cases I believe they're observing even lower Linux latency atop bhyve. And I believe that's because the kernel isn't worrying about a USB subsystem. It's not worrying about all this stuff, and perhaps that can be built out, but when you're in an environment where you rely on, say, a vendor like CentOS, you don't mess with your operating system, you don't have Podria, you don't have that just malleability that we take for granted and have for a very long time. We have NetMap Vert.io in the works, which will provide a much faster network stack, and there are 2 contending projects to implement that. So it'll sort of work its way out which one is the proper one to institutionalize. And disk support is good enough. Vert.io has been a key point. bhyve is unique in that it leverages on processor hardware acceleration features. Primarily that is extended page tables, and those arrived in Intel Nehalem CPUs and AMD Barcelona CPUs. And the very early generation was a bit rough with most vendors. They didn't quite know how to do it right and get the BIOS right. But Sandy Bridge onward, it's been quite useful and performant. And using IOMMU, you can pass through PCI devices. And if you're a storage vendor, pass through your storage system from the controller card on up to your application. So all in all, disk performance is acceptable. Now the ecosystem. This is off a t-shirt, go away, or I will replace you with a very small shell script. So yeah, the cloud thing. We haven't collectively done cloud very well because we haven't had to do the cloud thing. We have an environment that's naturally conducive to containment. We have sane, predictable layouts of things. We do not have kernels that have a different name and timestamp every week or two, or for those rolling releases. We just don't have those problems. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, and naturally people want their open stacks. They want their anything with cloud or stack in the title, and that's cool, and there are various efforts that I'll touch on that get to that. But first off, if we're talking virtual machines, once you boot and you hit a NIT or whatever is in your future for managing startup, it's a standard POSIX compliant, within the variations on that spec, Unix system. And you can use whatever tool of choice you want. If you love Puppet, use Puppet. If you love Ansible, use Ansible. No hypervisor cares because that's your system administration task. Yes, there's the under the hood management of the hypervisor itself, and the official tool under FreeBSD is vmrun. It gets the basic job done. There is a libvirt effort. It's out there. That's fashionable. I don't know of anyone using it because, again, I'll replace you with a small shell script. And out of Poland and semi-half, there's work to produce OpenStack support and Open Contrail support. I believe there's a talk at BSDCan on that, and I encourage you to pursue that and ask what help they need, ask how far they are, and just make that happen, especially if you have a genuine use case where you want that tool. I don't have that use case, and I cannot make the right decisions to implement that. So if you do a tour of GitHub, you'll find various tools that relate to bhyve. And someone over breakfast pointed out various Xhive related tools. That's bhyve for OS X. I'll touch on that a little later. And Alan Jude's been working on a UCL, Universal Configuration Language, I believe, integration. And Steve Wills, who's in the room today, has just recently produced a Go-based REST API system he showed me, and that's encouraging. IOHive is a variation of IOCage supporting bhyve. I haven't checked the latest status of that, but that's the right thinking, that if you're leveraging your file system, you're leveraging your IOCage community and making it easy. And I've been working on and off, fortunately very lately, and I'm glad to show you individually after this, what I do with VMRC, which is an RC script loosely based on my 2005 work to support bhyve, Xen, and other containers available on FreeBSD. And being RC a POSIX idea, that's quite portable, and maybe it'll support KVM. I do not know. I'm open to it. And in the works, there is a Google Summer of Code project for ARM64. There's a GSOC project that is wrapping up a little late on Pixie support, and again, UEFI BIOS is is out in the wild, but in a private beta. And I can touch on that at the very end of the various damned if you do, damned if you don't approach to open source, where no matter what you do, someone will be upset. And vBSDcon 2017, the message I left supercomputing with, a conference in various cities, is that ARM64 is very exciting, and the work you saw mentioned from the foundation is very, very exciting. You get Xeon E3 performance for half the watts. And as we move to things like SSD flash, that's critical in growing data centers. That's critical in storage. That's critical in day job. So, as Michael Lucas put it, decision makers are terrible at deciding what to throw out. So as storage continues to grow, things like ARM64 are pretty critical, and I'm very grateful that both through Xen and bhyve, there are efforts to make FreeBSD a first-class client and have packages available. Thank you, Sean Bruno. And that's all very encouraging. In the honorable mention department, Cloud ABI, there was a talk at BSDCan, and it's another effort to leverage all the tools at hand. The Capsicum security framework, containment environment, and it produces a slimmed down FreeBSD ABI that is portable among various environments. I believe it relies on Combat64 Linux. And that's the kind of thinking where neat things can happen by removing stuff, not by adding it. So kudos to him for doing that. And there's a good BSD Now interview about the subject. An honorable mention, once again, NetBSD Xen. It never failed me. Their ZFS, unfortunately, is about V13, a little behind, and that could use some love. But another alternative, always appreciated. Just a week or two ago, OpenBSD announced their own hypervisor, VMM, intending to do things that bhyve does not do, which, okay, I'll entertain that. I certainly hope there's opportunity for overlap and joining of forces there. And of course, OS X Xhive, which I touched on, which leverages Apple's framework, where you remove things from bhyve, leverage what's there, and get a working solution. I believe it's running FreeBSD and Linux on top of OS X, and I welcome you to try that. It came out of the blue. And in this general theme, BSD is participatory. So I'm so glad folks are here today. Help is always wanted. In this environment, we can run any BSD with very little effort. We can support your cloud thing as appropriate. We can use your help spreading the word. And as I believe it was Alan Jude put it in a BSD Now, we recharge our batteries at events like this. That is critical. The hallway conversation is critical to just making those little things happen, and it's very tangible. And yes, as we were joking last night, when people have kids, it affects really schedules, and it's not bureaucracy driven, and I appreciate that. And to reiterate a message earlier, I encourage you to donate. If you have any issue with one of the other BSDs, donate to another. It's all good, it's all win. The code sharing is critical. There's a BSD certification effort going on. I'm very glad to see there are some tests going on during this event, and that's been going around the world. And briefly about BSD certification, a lot of folks like to laugh at certification because, well, gee, a little time in the trenches beats that. And if you're in a, say, non-Western nation where you need to distinguish yourself with a very small budget, taking the initiative to do something like certification is very powerful and sets you aside. And I welcome you to both spread the word on that, get yourself certified, give feedback on what it needs to do. And as touched on in the previous talk, I highly encourage you to stay current with things like the FreeBSD Journal, BSD Now TV, very good podcast, very timely, BSD Talk, the wonderful original long-term BSD podcast. 250-something episodes, and very fascinating. So above all, get involved. I very intentionally went all Robert Watson in speed so I can address questions. We do have some of the key people here in the room, and we can get authoritative answers, and that's something very unique to such events, unlike vendor conferences and the like. Glenn Barber, if you're here, thank you very, very much for making it possible to give this talk on FreeBSD 11 with Xorg and LibreOffice and all that, and that's directly a result of what the Foundation's been doing, and I greatly appreciate that. So let's open up to questions, and I'm very happy to go into depth and some of those challenges on the damned if you do, damned if you don't. Yes, sir?
I was just curious, what is the image format that's supported? I mean, does it support, VMware or VirtualBox or something?
bhyve, strictly raw images, and that's proven very useful with my work because bhyve, Xen, QEMU, VirtualBox do not care what is there after that first little block, boot sector. And the little OS on that boot sector forward does not care what environment it's in, unless it's Windows licensing saying, whoa, you changed something, that's a whole different problem we don't have. But I know there are efforts to, say, bring in QCOW support and VMDK support, and there are tools to convert and ongoing discussions of what tools we can have in base to convert. QEMU image is quite good, but not perfect, and the licensing is not perfect, and so that's not yet where we want to be. But when you're passing through, say, a ZVol as a block device for a virtual machine, raw is your friend. And I do want to confirm if, say, the SimH emulator will support a ZVol block device that you can have your VAX emulation system running BSD 4.3 on a ZVol and snapshotable. And that's one of the things you can do with all these wonderful tools. So block devices have served me very well, and also going with them, on my lovely ThinkPad with an Ultra Bay drive, I aim bhyve at the hardware second drive, install from an off-the-shelf official release image, and boot bare metal. So things like P to V, physical to virtual, and virtual to physical are very compelling, and I want zero barriers in that. If it's bootable, iSCSI block device, great. I don't want to have to worry, and I don't want barriers. So things like a new unique standard for a disk image, no thank you, I'm good. So, hope that answers your question. Yes, sir.
Hey, Michael, I appreciate the talk. One reminder to folks, if you're comfortable, I encourage you to come up to the mic and ask, and that way the questions get recorded along with the presentation. If you don't want to come up here, then for speakers, please repeat the question.
I will repeat the question. I believe it has touched
so
on the block device.
I noticed you mentioned Windows is waiting in the wings, and I'm almost afraid to even ask. But can you talk a little bit more about what you expect to see, say, regarding timelines and what you think will happen with Windows in that space?
Yes, gladly. And the question is, just in case that was missed, about Windows and, from this side's perspective, UEFI, which is an largely emulation-free way of booting things in the last few years. And love it or hate it, it's on your laptop, it's on your hardware, and thank you, Foundation, for pursuing UEFI support on the bare metal OS. So the goal was to unveil in the wild the UEFI support at this event. So it is very, very close. It's been an effort among completely unrelated parties. So I won't call it blame, but timelines have been spread out, and it's not been a linear process, and we appreciate that because each person is doing what they can do best. I'm well aware that people are threatening with checkbooks over Windows support. Getting back to the hyperconverged buzzword, yes, if you have a fantastic storage system and you have spare CPU cycles, it's very wise to run on the same box. And you save on a 10 gig switch and the interconnects and all that expensive infrastructure. So about the damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you release super early and have bugs, you instantly get a reputation for the rest of your project's life that it's a buggy system. If you participate early on, but your code is a moving target, you're a bad person for having a moving target. You're a bad person for not accepting patches that will be perhaps obsolete in a week. There's that pressure. Let's see, if you work in silence, you're a jerk because, well, you're working in silence and you haven't early on received feedback from the community. And, well, it's kind of suspicious that you're working in open source in silence and dropping a big old bomb, and then it raises questions, will you be following up with that? Because, hey, that's out of nowhere. So in thinking about this based on conversations last night, I'm not sure what the right model is, but a key point with bhyve and ZFS, the two key technologies that I'm focusing on, they are not for every developer out there. There's a handful of people on this planet who are familiar with those systems. Fortunately, people like Matt Ahrens are showing up at BSDCons, a ZFS co-developer, fantastic person, and to see Matt Ahrens and Kirk McCusick working side by side and attending talks, that's stunning, but it's not work that sadly many people can do. And if we want to blame the hardware architectures and the 600-page book on just the EPT function, not my fault. So I appreciate everyone's patience in that. Things like accusations of vaporware are never appreciated. I welcome you to propose strategies that just mitigate from day one with, and keep in mind, zero marketing budgets on the part of individual developers and their peers and such. So this community's been very, very good. There've been some noisy concerns, and that's cool, that comes with all this. But in the long run, if the result is rock solid software, and here, let's do a quick poll. Who's using bhyve in the room? Anyone? Anyone? I see about a quarter of the room. Who's had a kernel panic relating to bhyve? 2 hands. Three. How early did you try it? Recently? Any recent panics? Okay. I've seen hundreds of panics relating to bhyve, but that's because I was in the trenches, dodging the bullets and trying it on weird configurations, weird hardware, etc. And that slowly branched out to folks like, again, Alan Jude, who received nifty new hardware and kindly let the developers dog food with it. And that's painful. When you fail on a kernel, you fail catastrophically. It's not like, oh, I'll run the app again. Oh, I'll just work my way back. So thank you for your patience. And if, again, you have the perfect model, let me know. And I've been patiently waiting for the foundation and all the FreeBSD developers to just march in and say, bhyve is how it goes, and we're going to run with it. Because I'm not a FreeBSD developer. I'm a user. And, hey, I'm so glad to see the use that's been there. And please corner me, corner the developers, ask your questions, provide your suggestions, ask how to implement stuff relating to it, because the knowledge there, yes, is not completely covered by the man page. It can't be. It would be pages long. It would be an encyclopedia, and it changes frequently. So just go organic, please. Yes, sir.
Hi, Dan Mahoney. So one of the killer apps that the VMware has out there, especially if you're running ESXi, and one of the things they love to gouge you for the license on is the technology that they call vMotion, the ability to hot jump a VM from one machine to another, and in some cases with even more money and even more licensing, the ability to do this automatically if your host is shutting down or going into maintenance mode or failover. And this is the thing that makes your middle managers' mouths water, because it means you can do hardware maintenance on any one machine. And I'm not seeing a whole lot of that support in the open VMware, well, the open hypervisor world. I don't see a lot of it in Xen, and some of it depends on a storage backend that has 2 things pointing at. But where do you see the future of that coming from, and do you see it becoming a thing that will be readily available in the open source marketplace?
The migration question. So the new Xen in October should include some migration plumbing. What that means, I haven't investigated too closely, but in that regard, for what it's worth, we leverage the community that's very active and partnering with the Linux Foundation, dollars flying every direction. So in bhyve, touching on the last talk, things like suspend and resume are your friend, and I would prefer leverage the dickens out of the infrastructure you have. So a virtual environment is generally very, very predictable. So suspending and resuming in a virtual environment is not a question of supporting 50 to 100 popular laptop models and then X number of zillions of grumble other models, so that with that in place, a combination of perhaps a hibernate, frequent ZFS snapshots and sends, packet filter carp, so that your application is aware of things not responding on, well, responding on a different the same IP on a different machine back, and your storage hopefully accommodating that, perhaps through, say, network attached storage. Depending on the system and what it's running, you can keep snapshotting, you can put it to sleep, move it to where you have to, which is only those diffs of the most recent on-disk activity, and bring it up. And if you've architected your application right, no one will notice. So that I can script. I do not know what's under the hood of vMotion. I know checksumming is one of the classic, checkpointing is a classic difficult computer science problem, and getting that right could be just as difficult as getting the hypervisor itself right. And yes, VMware has its money gun that just blasts at its development teams, and that's great, I appreciate that, but from the onset, I'd just love to see that suspend, resume, hibernate, and I can make that work. And if I can trick you into appearing that it did the same magical thing with all in-base tools, I think we've won.
So then one follow-up question as maybe an even further reaching project. When the heck do you think we're going to have a man page for bhyve control?
I invite you to turn 180 degrees, now 90 degrees to your left, and inquire. The one key developer is here, and let's sit down.
And my snark hat on, so.
Absolutely. So the bhyve control man page. The hallway track is your friend. The wiki's out of date. I was maintaining that separately, and then at the request of a great many people, I opened it to the masses to flood in and jump on it and bring it up to date and bring their experiences to it, and I'm going, okay, let me go add this thing I just remembered, which is not the greatest model. So let's punch through that. Are you good with Mandoc and the layout format?
I'm willing to try.
Okay.
If it was a shell script, I'd have already written it. It's C. My reading of C isn't all that great,
okay,
but I'm willing to
cool.
say, look, help.
So yes, documentation is critical. Drew Levine, probably at the table in front, thank you for your efforts and doc sprints and making it human readable, making it available to the masses. And all of us should document what we're doing. We're all guilty of falling short in various ways. We all have opportunities there. My complete interaction with the FreeBSD project is a wiki commit bit. So, okay, you'll see some stuff show up for Xen and bhyve, and that's the extent of that. So I welcome us all to come together. Ask your questions, make your requests, share your findings, share your neat tricks, because you have hardware the developers don't have, I guarantee. You have a use case that I absolutely guarantee the developers don't have. So please be interactive on that. I saw a hand in back.
So you'd mentioned that block containers with using ZFS were a good idea as far as storage provisioning for bhyve. What if you, with Citrix Xen Server, use the block storage in a zvol and you created a VHD to start with? Will that be an accepted image format for bhyve, or is it a good idea to try to transition away from that upon migration?
Are you currently using VMDK or VHD and be it
Well,
Microsoft
it's-
format? Or
So it's like an
choose your vendor.
iSCSI connected ZVol, but within that ZVol is a VHD file that Xen server sees, and that's what it uses for storage.
Okay. I will always default to simple. And if you saw my talk on block devices, stepping through a raw device and looking at the partitioning that GPT created just from the first set there is predictable. And if I have to engage in any kind of recovery, low level, if anything, seeing if something's there, I
Right.
want a raw block device. And I haven't seen an amazing, compelling feature short of the copy on write of QCal, but ZFS blows that out of the water.
Right.
So I don't see what you're getting beyond either compression, which ZFS also blows away,
Yeah.
or a config file, which text handles that really, really well and has for 40 years. So if vendors are pushing a proprietary format, that's not my problem. I wouldn't encourage anyone to, as a user, encourage that. I'd almost demand that things, that vendors just stay compatible.
As far as, and maybe this is more of a ZFS question, as far as like migrating away from that VHD, would it maybe be possible to, because it should be possible to mount the VHD, then can I use like maybe the DD command or something to do a block copy to the ZVol?
Yes,
Would that be-
once you hit POSIX in some way, bring in your NT device. There's, for what it's worth, reasonably good fuse support for Linux file systems and NTFS. And yes, DD is your friend. Once you're in the Unix environment,
That'd be the
nothing's
way
in your way. And if I had my tiny fraction of that large budget, so installing an OS, let's see, we do some partitioning. That's been pretty standardized. We splat down a tarball typically of either individual binaries or the works and go to town. The support is pretty good for NTFS. For ext2, I want to provision guests entirely in the familiar environment. tar really doesn't care what OS it's splatting down.
Yeah.
Gpart really doesn't care what actual little string is determining the partition, and that's largely ignored, except by the kernel says, oh, this is supposed to be ZFS. But you can format your ZFS partition to FAT32, and because the system is just a linear machine that gives you enough rope to hang yourself, but allows you to truly be flexible. So that's my whole take on it, and I've not seen a compelling value to those VMDK formats and other proprietary formats, except for the fact that, gee, this vendor uses it and somebody
I've
wants that.
noticed some limitations, like even the proprietary Citrix Xen server. It complains if you create a VHD that's larger than 2 terabytes, for example. For example of why it's.
Yes, and I've heard of people doing Windows Server and concatenating 2 gigabyte images simply because that's what you have to do. That's a trick you have to play. And it's like, that shouldn't be a barrier. It's not my fault.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, and please catch me in the hallway. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to put you in touch with users, developers, and perhaps show a demo. And if you have an image you want to boot, if it's your thing, if it's a firewall image, well, let's look at how to get it to boot under bhyve. It was frustrating that of all the mainstream operating systems, FreeBSD was not ready for serial awareness, that if you don't have a video device, let's try the serial port. Linux handled that well, OpenBSD handled that well, NetBSD handled that well, so at literally vBSDcon 2 years ago, we had a Skype conversation with 3 people and one of the developers in California and figured out how to orchestrate that and make that not break anything else, of course, and bring in a feature that should have been there for decades. And one surprise in all this is, okay, so I wish I had all my serial switches from like the late 90s because I need them right now. We're living in serial now that we're virtualizing. So things like tmux screen are your friend. The developers have found bugs in the NMDB serial interfaces simply because no one's used them for years. But these types of tools find those bugs, and those are not in any way related to the specific hypervisor. That's just the environment and shining the light, revealing the cockroaches, and cleaning up the dust that's in the system. So I'm very grateful that any type of virtualization, I mean, I want to see them all running because they find bugs. And Illumos support is very, very exciting because if you can have one environment with Illumos ZFS, FreeBSD ZFS, both of which are tier 1 platforms, Linux ZFS, all working simultaneously, and you can, even for documentation alone, compare the output, compare the man pages, compare all of that. That's a huge win and time saver. So I think virtualization is your friend. There's time for one or two last questions. Yes, sir.
I suppose I'm a bad person, but I use pixie booting all the time for the stuff I do.
You're a great person.
I'm curious, what is the difficulty? I mean, ever since I used VirtualBox and they had this special module that supported it, I was like, this can't be that huge a deal. So give me an insider's view, please.
Sure, pixie booting. Well, GSOC project that was supposed to be finished this very moment is in the works, and I have every reason to believe it will be completed. I do recall a few tricks and hacks to get either NFS booting or other things to work not too long ago, but it's purely a question of human resources. And if you are the FreeBSD or general BSD pixie boot person in the room, raise your hand and let's find out what plumbing is needed. Keep in mind that things like Xen are leveraging QEMU, which has a whole lot of plumbing. It has BIOS plumbing. It has VNC plumbing. It has all this useful stuff that just would work off the shelf. But bhyve took a completely different approach by focusing on emulation free and not emulating BIOS, not emulating the VNC, and all those moving parts. And the result is a pretty stable system. Yes, sir. Second question.
No, I was just trying to follow the question of what is the deal with pixie booting? Is this like the code exists, but it's in one of these emulated pieces that you aren't using? Is that the essence of it?
I haven't followed the projects. It's only been the last few months that the developer's been working on it, but I'm happy to get those answers.
Okay.
It's a GSOC project to do exactly that,
Okay.
and in a native way as opposed to a piece of plumbing ported to it. So catch me after this,
Thanks.
and we'll find that out. We want all the features. There's no question there, but it's a question of finding the expert who can do that in their immense amount of free time and make it happen. Last question? Anyone? Thank you very, very much. Thank you, VeriSign. Thank you, Ripken Company. Thank you, Glenn, and every developer out there who makes this possible.